Thank you for joining me today. My name is Julia Galhar, and this is Central News Live. Today I will be discussing a topic that is always in the news, the Syrian refugee crisis. The Syrian refugee crisis has been in the media since March 2011, when according to BBC, an estimated 11 million Syrians have fled their homes since the outbreak of the civil war in Syria, and have looked for asylum in the United States and Europe, caused controversy about letting the refugees in. However, how has the Syrian refugee crisis been portrayed in domestic and in the international media? Join me as I shed light on several media publications and analyze and use various concepts and theories such as the agenda setting theory and fear mongering to better understand the media's perspective on the Syrian refugee crisis. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a refugee as a person who flees to a foreign country or power to escape danger or persecution. According to the BBC, more than 250,000 Syrians have lost their lives during the 4.5 years of conflict, which began with anti-government protests before turning into a civil war. More than 11 million people have been forced from their homes as forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad and those opposed to his rule battle each other, as well as jihadi militants from so-called Islamic State. Neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey have struggled to deal with one of the largest refugee crises in recent history. According to CNN, about 10% of Syrian refugees have escaped for safety in Europe, creating political issues as countries argue over who will take in refugees and who will not. This is the story of the Civil War. Before I begin my analysis, I want to give you an overview of the Syrian refugee crisis, in particular to how so many of the refugees ended up in Europe. According to CNN, it began when pro-government protesters held up pictures of the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad and pictures of his father Hafez al-Assad during a protest in Damascus, Syria on March 18, 2011. These protesters were demanding that the government enact reforms and to release political protesters that they had kept hostage. In August of 2011, US and European leaders called for an al-Assad to step down and to allow the Syrian people to dictate their political future. From December 2011 to February 2012, violence escalated after security forces opened fire on protesters, and due to this opposition, forces took action in defending themselves. The country fell into a civil war as rebel brigades were formed for control of cities and towns. The violence finally reached Damascus and Aleppo in 2012. What started as an anti-regime protest has spiraled into a civil war. The conflict in Syria is not just a battle about al-Assad. It has caused the country's Sunni majority against al-Assad's section and created a rise in the jihadist group Islamic State. According to the BBC, a UN commission of inquiry has proof that all parties in the Syrian crisis have participated in war crimes such as murder, torture, and rape. Accusations of civilian suffering such as blocking food, water, and medical aid have been brought to the attention of the world. According to CNN, in February of 2013, the US sent in medical aid and food, but not military aid of any kind. But in May of 2013, European countries agreed to send in military aid by lifting the arms embargo against Syria. In 2014, the US launches airstrikes on Syria with participating Arab countries. As of December 2015, Europe has taken in 1 million Syrian refugees, according to CNN. As I continue to inform you of the issue, allow me to bring to your attention some questions one should ask regarding domestic and foreign media coverage of the Syrian refugee crisis, in particular to the European countries who had a large intake of refugees such as Germany, Austria, and Sweden. Why have so many European countries and their politicians opened their borders to Syrian refugees but the United States and its politicians haven't? Is the majority of negative opinion about the Syrian refugee crisis from domestic media coverage in the United States? How does the media coverage in European countries about the Syrian refugee crisis differ than the coverage in the United States? What ideas are the United States media trying to install in the minds of the listeners? Before I begin to describe the analysis of the media coverage throughout the top intake European countries, let me inform you of the different media outlets I researched. Some of the major publications that were observed were the United States CNN and Huffington Post. Most of the United States media would generally be assumed to be liberal, but most of the time the conclusions leaned towards a more moderate stance. For my European media, I used BBC, Deutsche Welle, The Local, and Nordischen. In total, I analyzed 19 news articles. While the content of my domestic media and European media had the same timeline in history of events of the Syrian refugee crisis, the media coverage of the refugee intake was completely different. In order to provide information of the timeline of events during the Syrian refugee crisis, I used BBC as my foreign media source and CNN as my domestic media source. The agenda-setting theory and the fear-mongering theory are both used heavily in the way information is distributed. The agenda-setting theory is defined as an ability of the news media to influence the salience of topics on the public agenda. That's if a news item is covered frequently and prominently, the audience will regard the issue as more important. For instance, in United States media, the coverage focuses on how politicians don't want refugees to be welcomed here, but don't focus on the amount of refugees the United States has welcomed. The fear-mongering theory is defined as the deliberate use of fear-based tactics to influence the public in order to achieve a desired outcome. An example of the fear-mongering theory is showing dead bodies of civilians in order to create a fear outcome of viewers. After reading several articles, I concluded that my research shows that there is a considerable amount of hostility from American media regarding the Syrian refugee crisis. The American media tends to focus on quotes from politicians on what type of people they assume these Muslims are. In an article from CNN titled, "Donald Trump, Syrian Refugees a Trojan Horse," Donald Trump was quoted saying, "We have no idea who these people are. We are the worst when it comes to paperwork." He continued to say that he is more against allowing Syrian refugees into the United States because it could be a way to sneak terrorists into the country, which shows that he thinks all Muslims are terrorists, a common misconception using the fear-mongering theory. Now we will move on to the European media. International media reporting on the Syrian refugee crisis tends to be more informative. For example, in an article from Deutsche Welle titled, "Berlin's Arab Robe Welcomes Newcomers," the article speaks about a section of town which is called Arab Robe, and that has always welcomed migrants from the Arab world, but the difficulty that they have gone through learning a new language, but the opportunities they have had, such as opening their own business. In the article, it also speaks about a cultural center started by older Syrian migrants and how this makes the transition process easier for these new migrants. An important part of this article is that it highlights the goal of the Syrian refugees, stating that they just want to be a part of German society. This video shows the difference between the United States media coverage and European media coverage. The European media is proud to have welcomed the Syrian refugees, and they are showing what type of life is available for refugees who want to come there versus the United States, focusing on the politics of the situation and what harm the Syrian refugees could do to the country. As you can see, both American media and international media have different ways of reporting on the Syrian refugee crisis. The agenda-setting theory and fear-mongering theory play a large role in the perception that the viewers have. The Syrian refugee crisis is not just a humanitarian crisis, but a new civil war that has women and children in its path of destruction. The news stories from the US encourage one perception of the crisis, whereas news stories from Europe show a different perspective, with how they are integrating the Syrian refugees into their country. Again, this is Julia Gelhar reporting with Central News Live. Good night.